In 18th century France, the art of making objects in gilt bronze involved eminent artists and master craftsmen who perfected complex techniques of casting, chasing, and gilding to create objects of the utmost refinement. Today, this art is preserved in the hands of just a few individuals who reveal here the secrets of Pierre Gouthière, one of the most talented chasers and gilders in 18th century France. The production of a gilt bronze object always began with a drawing from an architect or a designer. From this drawing, Gouthière would create models. He used wood for simple shapes, like this flower. But for more complex shapes, he preferred wax, a more malleable material. First, he used a sharp tool to draw the design on the surface of the wax. Then he used carving tools to create details, like this delicate wreath of leaves. For refining shapes, he used spatulas and heated tools. The back was also finely worked. The models were an exact 3D interpretation of the drawing. The next step was to make a plaster mold from each model. Here, the wooden flower is placed on a bed of clay. The plaster is prepared and poured onto the wooden model. This plaster mold could be used to create a pewter model. The melting point of pewter being quite low, it was easily reached in a gilder's forge like the one in Gouthière's workshop. This pewter model, also called a foundry model, was next chased and pierced to provide a well-developed positive to be used in the sand casting of the final brass element. The plaster mold was more often used to create an intermediate wax model, a step towards creating a stronger foundry model, this time in brass. A foundry model in brass could be used multiple times to duplicate an object if necessary. These wax models were refined in Gouthière's workshop. He often mentioned that he had recut and in one instance chased them. The wax model was moulded in sand using a chassis. The lower half of the chassis was filled with sand that was compacted and smoothed. The back of the wax was filled with sand, the excess brushed away and placed on the bed of sand. The wax and sand were lightly dusted with talc or starch to aid in separating the moulds later in the process. The mould was made in several pieces to allow the wax model to be removed without destroying the mould. The first section of this piece mould was made by compressing sand against the wax model. After the first section was formed, the adjacent section was made. When the 4 sections were done, the upper half of the chassis was put into place, filled with sand and smoothed. The 2 halves of the chassis were separated and the sections of the mould disassembled to remove the wax model. Gates and vents were cut into the sand, and the chassis was closed again and prepared for pouring molten brass. The chassis was later separated and the brass removed. The foundry models in brass were then sent back to Gouthière's workshop to be chased and pierced. When the foundry model was chased, it made a return trip to the foundry, where it was moulded in sand, using the sand casting technique just described, to cast the final object in brass. Once the rough castings returned to Gouthière's workshop, he chased them using a variety of tools. With files, chasing tools, and a hammer, he brought the metal to life by creating a vast range of textures. The soft skin of a face, a goat's rippled fur, or the alternating textures of its horns, the fine veins of leaves, the flow of water. The first step in the process of chasing was to trim the coarse edges of the rough casting using files. Gouthière also used files to bevel the receding edges of a piece, which gave an impression of lightness to the metal. Piercings into the metal were done with a bow drill and a fret saw. The piece was placed on a pitch bowl filled with mastic-like material. The backsides of the pieces were often punched with a sharp tool to add texture that allowed for better grip on the pitch. The cast iron bowl rested on a leather ring, allowing it to be tilted to the appropriate angle for working the entire surface of the piece. Like most chasers, Gouthière had hundreds of chasing tools. The chasing tools fall into 6 categories, each with a specific purpose. Tracers are for outlining a form or creating linear ornamentation. Planishers, the heads of which come in many different shapes, are flat, highly polished tools used to smooth metal. Purling tools are concave half-spheres used, as the name suggests, for shaping pearls. The counterpart to a purling tool is a boutrolle, a rounded punch used to create such recesses on the head of the swan. Matting tools come in many shapes and sizes, and have patterned heads for creating a variety of textures. Gouthière produced here a remarkably uniform surface by using a single matting tool, likely a mat sablé, hammered in straight rows. The various elements of an object that were cast and chased separately were now assembled together. Gouthière's preferred method was soldering, which means joining 2 metal elements by melting a metal alloy, solder, capable of fusing them together. With the completion of the chasing, the elements were ready for gilding. Like his contemporary gilders, Gouthière used mercury gilding with or moulu, ground gold. The process began with annealing the brass by placing it on a bed of lit charcoal. The piece was heated to cherry red, then cooled to soften the work-hardened brass to make it less brittle. The piece was next pickled in acid, either sulfuric or dilute nitric, to remove the layer of oxides from the surface. It was then rinsed in water and dried in tan bark until completely dry. The gold-mercury amalgam consisted of 8 parts mercury and 1 part gold, in powder form or slivers of gold leaf, mixed together. When well mixed, the amalgam was washed in water. The amalgam was applied to the object with a stiff brass bristle brush. Once the part was well covered with amalgam, it was exposed to lit coals and heated carefully. The whole process was repeated up to 4 times, depending on the amount of gold desired on the surface. The piece was then placed in the fire again until the mercury vaporized. When the layer of gold was deemed perfect, the piece was carefully brushed and washed with water acidulated with vinegar, and finally dried. After the piece was gilded, it received its final finish, which in late 18th century France typically included burnishing, as well as applying colouring and matting agents to the gold. Burnishing was created by rubbing the gold with a burnisher of hematite or bloodstone affixed to a wooden handle. The burnisher was dipped in water acidulated with vinegar, and then rubbed on the surface, compacting the grains of gold to increase its reflectance. For a matte finish, Gouthière developed a chemical treatment known as dorure mat, which translates as matte gilding, that created a consistent layer of gold with a microscopically spongy texture, which produced the matte appearance. The process began with the application to the surface of a mixture of saltpeter, sea salt, and alum in water. The piece was returned to the fire, heated until the mixture became homogeneous, almost transparent, then immediately plunged into clear water to remove the layer of salt. This is a reproduction of a knob made by Gouthière, after a design by the architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux. In 1770, Ledoux created one of the most lavish French 18th century buildings, the Pavilion of Louvciennes. The interior decoration was removed and sold to various collectors after the French Revolution, so it can no longer be viewed in its original splendour, but rare elements, like Jean-Honoré Fragonard's 4 panels depicting the progress of love, painted for the pavilion's Salon en cul de four, and now in the Frick collection, as well as this knob, made for the same room, attest to the pavilion's former glory. The interlinked D and B stand for Louvciennes' owner, the celebrated Madame du Barry. Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who painted this portrait of Louis XV's mistress, wrote her souvenirs while in exile, far from home, and at a time when the people she had known under the Ancien Régime were dead. With nostalgia, she recalled the bronzes by Gouthière, who came to incarnate for her a time forever gone.
Every day, after dinner, we would go to take coffee in this pavilion, so renowned for the taste and richness of its ornamentation. The salon was ravishing. The chimney pieces, the doors, everything was fashioned in the finest possible way. Even the locks could be admired as masterpieces of the goldsmith's art.